This is Chris Bolt with Revelationary Apologetics, and you're listening to Christ or Chaos. This episode of Christ or Chaos is part one of a brief series responding to a video from David Pallmann titled, What's Wrong with Presuppositional Apologetics? A Response to Greg Bahnsen. In this episode, I want to address the epistemological issue of direct acquaintance proffered by Pallmann. David Pallmann proposes a classical foundationalism wherein, quote, all beliefs come in one of two types, inferential and non-inferential. Every justified inferential belief ultimately owes its justification to a justified non-inferential belief. These justified non-inferential beliefs are thought to be foundational because all other knowledge is built upon them, end quote. For him, these foundational beliefs are best accounted for in a theory of direct acquaintance, henceforth DA. Pallmann claims, quote, non-inferential justification consists of three distinct acquaintances. 1. Direct acquaintance with a thought. All beliefs are a sort of thought. A thought is true when it corresponds to facts in reality. Thoughts, therefore, are truth-bearers. 2. Direct acquaintance with a fact. Facts are actual states of affairs. They exist independently of thoughts. A thought can only be true when it corresponds to a fact. Thus, facts are truth-makers. 3. Direct acquaintance with the correspondence between a thought and a fact. The direct acquaintance with correspondence between truth-bearer and truth-maker ensures that the belief is justified and infallibly so. End quote. Pallmann sincerely believes, quote, these three acquaintances taken in conjunction with each other constitute a sufficient account of how one can be immediately justified through perceptual awareness, end quote. He continues, quote, direct acquaintance is not itself a belief, but it relates a subject to a fact in such a way that the subject is aware of the correspondence between his thought and the fact that makes it true, end quote. I want to focus first on correspondence within DA and then on acquaintance itself. Pallmann takes thoughts to be the truth-bearers and facts to be the truth-makers in DA. With this admission, a question arises as to the relation between thoughts and facts in DA. DA assumes an intelligible structure to the world in terms of something like mind-independent facts, facts that exist distinct from the thoughts which correspond to them. But a number of potential difficulties with correspondence haunt such a view. First, even though Pallmann's theory does not necessitate that facts are actual external states of affairs, it is at least possible that they are in some instances. But if we cannot step outside of our thoughts to compare our thoughts to facts, to the correspondence between them, then we're stuck with whatever these direct acquaintances deliver. Second, it would seem that facts are indiscernible from truth-bearers. Facts, which are supposed to be the truth-makers in Pallmann's view, might merely be derivative of thoughts as truth-bearers, for the sake of establishing correspondence. Third, truth-bearers can be complex such that they correspond to complex, disreputable truth-makers. Fourth, truth-bearers are actually like truth-bearers and nothing else, which collapses the correspondence relation. Fifth, correspondence is deeply mysterious insofar as it can relate any truth-bearer to any truth-maker, regardless of time or place. How do such chronological and spatial relations obtain? Sixth, correspondence would seem to differ as to objects. For example, whatever it is that connects a logical truth to a logical fact would differ in the instance of some other relation involving something other than a logical truth or logical fact or both. Correspondence becomes so broad as to encompass equivocation in relation to its objects. Seventh, Pallmann's proposal posits direct acquaintance with the correspondence relation in DA. Correspondence, in Pallmann's understanding, is a symmetric relation, such that a thought corresponds to a fact, and a fact corresponds to a thought. But Pallmann submits that facts are the truth-makers of truth-bearing thoughts, which means that they stand in an asymmetrical, or at any rate non-symmetrical, relation to one another. Eighth, were acquaintance with correspondence propositional in form, this would entail the need for further justification of said correspondence. Pallmann avoids this particular difficulty by construing correspondence in some sense other than propositional. Acquaintance with correspondence is simply acquaintance with a fact. Thus, correspondence is non-conceptual and non-propositional in Pallmann's view. Unfortunately, this account of correspondence leaves us with very little to go by in understanding a theory of DA. At worst, Pallmann is forced into the difficulties of correspondence theory, and at best, Pallmann is merely equivocating between correspondence in its ordinary or philosophical sense and some unspecified, nebulous, non-propositional, non-conceptual, and supposedly justificatory use in order to convey some sort of meaning across the subjectivist divide. The same problem plagues Pallmann's account of acquaintance itself, even apart from what we've considered regarding correspondence. In Pallmann's theory of DA, beliefs are justified without other beliefs by connecting the subject of knowledge to the truth makers of beliefs directly and apart from mediating arguments. But what exactly is this direct acquaintance? If direct acquaintances are propositional or conceptual, then they stand in further need of justification. So direct acquaintances are themselves non-propositional and non-conceptual, just as we saw before with correspondence, which is itself non-propositional and non-conceptual, according to this theory. It follows that acquaintance is difficult to describe at best. Moreover, acquaintance would seem to be incapable of justifying propositions and concepts. The two are categorically different from one another. Nevertheless, advocates of DA insist that acquaintances or combinations of acquaintances do provide non-inferential justification for all of our beliefs. Pallmann asks us to, quote, think of the belief that you have a headache. You do not infer this belief from some other belief. You're simply directly acquainted with the fact of it. But for you, the belief is immediately justified by virtue of your acquaintance with the fact that you are in pain. This is a first-person sort of justification, which you cannot show anyone else, but which is nonetheless real, end quote. Of course, one could infer the belief in a headache from another belief, and to say that one is simply directly acquainted with the fact of the headache is to restate the theory of direct acquaintance and nothing more. Moving on, belief in the proposition, I have a headache, or I am in pain, could be a true or false belief, but the acquaintance whereby it is supposedly justified is not itself a belief, and is neither true nor false on Pallmann's view. Pallmann continues, quote, the same sort of point extends to any experience. What you see, hear, feel, smell, or taste is all justified through your direct acquaintance with the fact that you have these experiences. Now, I hasten to add that this account does not assume that your experiences correspond to external state of affairs. You could very well be seeing an illusion, but that does not change the fact that you see it. Hence, this belief that you see something is immediately justified, end quote. As in the case of the headache, which is definitionally a pain in the head, appeal to the five senses in an explanation of an instance of direct acquaintance does actually assume an external state of affairs, at the very least within the hypothetical. One might wish to speak of direct acquaintances of different sorts apart from appeal to these external states of affairs. It's just clear that Pallmann has not done so, and it's not clear what it would look like to do so. Pallmann incorrectly claims that, quote, Bahnsen seems to grant that the foundationalist account does give one non-inferential justification for their beliefs. Although Bahnsen proceeds to act as though this is insignificant, this is actually a major concession on his part, end quote. Pallmann has misunderstood Bahnsen, as Bahnsen's merely describing the matter from the perspective of foundationalism, not granting the position. And Bahnsen is correct to note that certainty regarding external objects is impossible given this form of foundationalism, a point Pallmann must and does concede when he adds, a moment ago, that experiences do not necessarily correspond to external states of affairs. Noting again that we have not even left the level of purely subjective considerations, that is, we're not positing any external state of affairs, a number of difficulties appear to arise at precisely this point with Pallmann's analysis. First, the example of headaches and pain are problematic illustrations of foundational beliefs. Pallmann thinks the belief that you have a headache is immediately justified by acquaintance with pain. But this requires that you have a head to ache by definition. Moreover, Pallmann not only assumes pain is incorrigible, he interprets it as giving rise to a very specific belief about a headache, which seems wrong. For example, over 200 different types of headaches exist, and an individual can even have more than one of them at a time. Another problem with this account is that some will be led to say we have no pain, as a matter of fact, unless we're conscious of it. But is this true? Meanwhile, others might posit a state of affairs or a hypothetical where someone seems to be directly acquainted with pain, but has no pain in fact. So Pallmann's account does not get us very far. Perhaps these potential problems only apply at the level of belief, derivative of direct acquaintance. That nevertheless leaves us with a bad illustration of how direct acquaintance can serve to justify our foundational beliefs. And it's a concern when the only illustration Pallmann uses is one that's flawed at the level of the belief formed, especially when we don't understand the relation or process for belief formation in other scenarios regarding direct acquaintance and foundational beliefs, such as those without reference to an external state of affairs. Second, then, it's not clear that the example of headache or pain is related to other supposed direct acquaintances and beliefs formed upon their basis. What does acquaintance with pain have to do with all the other types of acquaintances a subject would need in order to have a foundation for other types of knowledge? The use of acquaintance with pain as incorrigible seems far too convenient an example. How does such an illustration relate to other supposed direct acquaintances that are not commonly associated with a physical sensation? The very fact that it's pain which is used as an example goes against the theory of DA being some commonsensical approach to other examples of awareness. And again, even if we could extend other examples out as a broad base, how does one move from them to almost anything else? What do they have to do with knowledge? Third, direct acquaintance gives us nothing by way of knowing truths. As already mentioned, non-inferential justification in terms of direct acquaintance is neither propositional nor conceptual, and thus it's not clear how mere mental awareness is justificatory in the first place, much less how it gives way to propositions to be believed. Fourth, thought experiments involving direct acquaintance with detailed appearances are not non-inferentially justified. Direct acquaintances with such truth makers are insufficient for the subject's non-inferential justification that the subject is appeared to in terms of all the details present to the subject. An indefinite number of scenarios face this fate. Fifth, DA just doesn't give us enough with regard to epistemological concerns. Even granting that we have belief in propositions which preclude the possibility of error, which has not been demonstrated by Pallmann, and even if the remainder of our knowledge is derived from these foundational principles by way of inference, we are reintroduced to other skeptical worries in terms of these inferences. The means of making such inferences are not subject to justification by direct acquaintance, and thus are themselves inferential, probabilistic, and problematic from the standpoint of the skeptic. This concession on the part of the DA theorist grants the proper premise of the presuppositional project, for we are addressing entire worldviews, not merely narrow epistemological concerns. Now, to be fair, I know there's more to the video that I'm not addressing in this episode. Sixth, granting a certain subject possesses direct acquaintance at some point does not account for an ability to retain justified concepts over time and through change in experience. As we've seen, a popular way of describing direct acquaintance is the incorrigible awareness of a headache. Suppose that awareness is followed by the awareness of an interesting conversation that pulls the subject away from the awareness of pain. Once the conversation ends, the subject is stuck again with the initial awareness or acquaintance with the fact of the headache, or so we would think. However, one's acquaintance with the headache in each scenario, once before the conversation and then after it is ended, would be distinct acquaintances. Seventh, starting with the autonomous self, as Pallmann purports to do, not only severs the subject of knowledge from God and the external world, as Pallmann would readily grant, as consistent with his theory, but also leaves one open to objections regarding the identity of the subject of knowledge with these supposed direct acquaintances. Not only should we ask how to distinguish the subject of knowledge from the objects of knowledge, but we should ask how one justifies the enduring entity of self. Why should we assume that acquaintance and the beliefs or thinking that are based upon it corresponds to a first-person I, or to the self? The comparisons being made between present and past moments in terms of direct acquaintance, as mentioned earlier, begs the question in favor of an enduring self with which a series of direct acquaintances does not concern itself. Perhaps the subject in this equation is nothing more than a collection of acquaintances. Collection here is misleading because of the difficulty of justifying memory, or memory with content, once we move beyond the basics of direct acquaintance. The purpose of direct acquaintance is simply to stave off skeptical worries, but it doesn't bring us much further than that. Eighth, if some of these objections seem unclear, it's not owing to the success of DA, but to the vague way in which DA advocates attempt to describe their position. We are at the limits of thought itself here, dealing with supposed justification for foundational belief, and addressing a very vague account of such things. What Pallmann presents is obscure and controversial. Not even those philosophers who hold to some form of direct acquaintance as justificatory agree on what exactly this means, or the relations between, say, truth-bearers and truth-makers, the role of correspondence or lack thereof, the proper place of beliefs, and the like. It's clear that for Pallmann, there is nothing more basic than direct acquaintance, but what is most basic does not belong to any other categories of thought. Thus, there's finally no real way to describe direct acquaintance to someone who's not privileged in such a way as Pallmann claims to be. While Pallmann considers DA an irreducible relation of sorts, other philosophers think of it in terms of awareness. The very nature of acquaintance is therefore called into question, especially in light of other objections to it. Obviously, these are not all of the objections that could be raised against the theory of DA. However, these are sufficient to show that the matter is not nearly as plain as Pallmann might want us to believe it is. Let's assume for the moment that Pallmann's case for DA is successful. DA is a narrow theory intended to answer a regress problem in epistemology, and that's it. Even if DA is successful, skeptical worries remain outside of the regress problem. Can DA sustain itself as the theory is drawn out into other topics like logic and induction? My next episode will attempt to answer that question in the negative. But for now, it's worth noting that it isn't exactly clear what any of this has to do with presuppositional apologetic methodology. Indeed, the presuppositionalists might agree with the DA theorist that we have direct acquaintances whereby some of our beliefs are non-inferentially justified. But this in no wise establishes the cogency of autonomous human reasoning in terms of worldview. Regardless, we have not seen that DA is successful. We have not seen that DA serves to provide direct and immediate non-inferential justification for our most basic beliefs. Pallmann claims, quote, the mere fact that we cannot show our justification does not mean that we are not justified. The presuppositionalist can complain about his inability to share our experience, but this does nothing to undercut it, end quote. It's not the presuppositionalist asking for this justification, but anyone who doesn't already believe this obscure and seemingly outmoded theory. More on this in a moment. Pallmann proceeds, quote, people will frequently claim to see things that they have never really seen, or to have heard things that they have never really heard, end quote. But in relation to his supposed justification, by way of laying claim to direct acquaintance, how could he ever know this? He continues, quote, the fact that some people abuse these avenues of knowledge does not mean that we cannot gain knowledge by means of visual and audible perceptions, end quote. And, quote, the same point extends to a priori knowledge. The mere fact that some people can abuse this avenue does not in any way mean that those of us who have genuine a priori insights are any less justified, end quote. Of course, but the question is as to whether or not we have a priori knowledge in the fashion Pallmann might want to insist we do, and whether or not we can objectively verify this as parties who are not privy to these so-called direct acquaintances. Pallmann seems to answer an objection pertaining to the private nature of his first-person account of epistemology by special pleading, conceding that others abuse this privileged account of personal justification, while swearing that he does not. From an outsider's perspective, though, there's no way to tell the difference. What is direct acquaintance, anyway? Philosophers who adhere to a theory of direct acquaintance disagree on the answer to this question. Even supposing that direct awareness, which does not admit of judgment, actually exists, what might we do with it? And how would it justify our beliefs when it is itself non-propositional, non-conceptual, incapable of accurate description? As it stands, DA rests upon a supposed inner awareness of something we cannot define and cannot describe except perhaps by way of metaphor, which is said to justify all of our knowledge at its base, but cannot be analyzed any more than that. DA is, in other words, a bit of a cop-out. If acquaintance is so simple as to resist definition, as acquaintance theorists propose, then what we really have here in the supposed justification provided by Pallmann and others is not a means of mollifying the skeptic, but an impenetrable mystery. Since acquaintance is non-propositional, non-conceptual, non-intentional, non-judgmental, and not more than awareness, it follows that one cannot know acquaintance without having an awareness of it. Yet there can be no further analysis of acquaintance either. So again, detractors are completely cut off from this epistemological theory and are left without any explanation of why acquaintance exhibits any of the features that it does. Why exactly would such a firm foundation admit of so many difficulties with regard to understanding, defining, and demonstrating its nature and its objects when it is, according to Pallmann, immediately and non-inferentially present to him? What is the nature of acquaintance? Is it a relation between the subject of knowledge and the object of awareness? Or is it a feature of particular mental states? And is it limited to qualification with something like attention? Also, what sorts of acquaintances can be obtained? What are the possible objects of direct acquaintance? The acquaintance theorist must admit that he is acquainted with acquaintance. As an aside, this assumes personal identity at the outset. Whatever illustrations are provided for how direct acquaintance works grant the objection that others really are not aware of such a thing as direct acquaintance, which undermines the theory, at least from the perspective of the skeptic. We can denounce direct acquaintance as myth without epistemic consequence, for the skeptic has received no non-subjective answer to the question of skepticism. The subjectivist is reduced to the same self-referential difficulties and egocentric predicaments of the solipsist, and the Christian continues to posit a worldview wherein knowledge is possible. Now, Pallmann is in no position to provide an answer to this objection, other than by assuming, again, the very thing that he sets out to prove, namely, that we finally have non-inferential justification for all of our beliefs in the theory of direct acquaintance. But to answer in that fashion is to beg the question. Still, maybe DA is correct. Perhaps it's not false or unjustified. It's just that Pallmann has provided us no reason for thinking otherwise, and indeed, in virtue of the theory itself, cannot do so in terms of rational engagement. An explicitly Christian epistemology, grounded in the Christian worldview, is not subject to such an objection. Pallmann would need to assume the truth of the Christian worldview, then, in order to demonstrate that DA is true. So the success and the failure of DA presuppose the Christian worldview.